falls on rocky ground. And in our story, the context of the story, that represents those people in the crowd who are looking for miracles. What can Jesus do for me? And once the emotion of that is worn off, once the difficulties come into their lives, the seed stops growing. It withers and it dies because they're not interested in a relationship with Jesus Christ, only what he can do for them. The third seed falls in the weeds. Interesting who this represents in the story. It's his family. It's his friends. And the challenge in their life is that they have so much to do. Places to go, people to see. The stress of their lives, his family, his friends, the people that have been following him, some very close, is that stress, the things that they have to do, it crowds out and it stifles the growth of the seed. 3/4 of the seed so far hasn't grown. 1/4, the last seed, is thrown on what we hear as good soil. And good soil, well, that represents those who hear. Those who hear. Pastor Ed last week talked about the difference between listening and hearing. These are the folks who hear. They're the ones who embrace the seed. Those are the ones who work it into their lives. It becomes a priority for them. And what it says to us in the text, and this is amazing, is that the fruit that they bear is beyond their wildest dreams. The actual text says 30, 60, 100-fold. Any farmers here, by the way? I'm not, but anybody? 100-fold on a crop is unbelievable. You see where Jesus is going with this story? I like the way Miles Monroe captures the truth when he says, imagine or suppose or think about the idea of taking an apple seed and placing it on a windowsill and leaving it there for 50 years. What do you think is going to happen? Nothing. That's absolutely right. Nothing's going to happen. Inside that seed is the potential for an apple tree. But you have to take that seed and you have to bury it deep into the soil of potential for anything to happen. That's what Jesus is wanting us to hear. Why doesn't 3/4 of the seed sown grow and bear fruit? Because it's not buried deep into the soil. The seed of Jesus Christ needs to be buried deep into the soul of each one of you and me. We need to bury it deeper than the simple road surface. We need to bury it deeper than the rocks. We need to bury it deeper than the weeds for it to get the kind of traction that we're talking about here. Let me give you an example. It's right out of the story. After the people who were at the beach listening to the teaching, after they went home, there were some left. Now, some of these folks had gone back to work, some had gone shopping, and as I said, some went home. But there was a remnant, in addition to the disciples, who stayed around. They were with Jesus. Jesus is sitting now on a log, feet in the water, sipping a lemonade. And after an uncomfortable period of time, one of the people there, not his disciple, but it could have been, says, Jesus, I have to tell you this. I don't get your story. I don't understand your point. Jesus takes another sip of lemonade, and he says, well, let me tell you to you this way. And what he does is he takes the story, as Ed read, and he explains it a little bit different than he did before. And then you know what happens? They all sit around, they talk about it. Jesus, the disciples, and these other people who had stayed behind, they all sit around, they chew on it, they kick it around. They argue about it. They try to bury it deep into their soul because they need to wrestle. You and I need to wrestle with the truth of Jesus Christ. We need to wrestle with the truth of his life, the truth of his miracles. We need to wrestle with the idea of heaven and hell and grace and works. It's not intuitively obvious what all those things mean. Wrestle with them. You see, that's what's being modeled here by Jesus. In your small groups, in our times of private Bible study, and in and how we live our lives. Work it out. Think about it. Build it, dig it deep down into our lives. That's what's being modeled here. A seed on the surface of the soil has very little chance of survival. Oh, it has some, but very little. But a seed that's buried deep into the soil has incredible power. Tim Keller, who I've referenced before, is a pastor at Redeemer Press in New York City. And he tells this story about a Baptist minister, could have been a Presbyterian too, but a Baptist minister, who's on vacation in Ireland, actually it was Italy, in Italy. And he goes into this graveyard that's sort of a tourist attraction. Oh, it's a tourist attraction because the graves are so very, very old. And he comes across this one particular grave, and it has this huge, thick marble headstone on top of it. And it must have been the headstone of a king or a very wealthy man because of how big and expensive it was. And what he saw was a tree growing out of the side of it. And what must have happened was an acorn fell into the grave centuries ago before it was covered over. But over the decades, actually over the centuries, first that tree had grown out the side of the grave. And then as the tree got bigger and bigger, it literally split that thick piece of marble in two and pushed it slightly to the side. Buried deep within that grave was the power, the potential power to split that marble gravestone. Well, what about the seed that doesn't grow? What about the seed that doesn't bear fruit? 3/4 of it doesn't. We talked about that. What about that? What about us? What about those soils in our lives that don't grow? The road, the rocks, the weeds. Now let me ask you a question. How often do you think a sower sows? How often does a farmer plant crops? Once? I don't think so. The land for the farmer is way too valuable. It costs him way too much to ignore those areas on his property where it's not bearing much fruit. What's he do? Well, he sends his workers out, doesn't he? He sends his workers out to cultivate the road, to dig out the rocks and to pull out the weeds. And then he plants again and again and again. You and I are way too valuable to God. We're way too costly for God to simply ignore those areas in our lives that are not bearing fruit. At God's own expense, He sends His only Son, Jesus Christ, to come into our lives, to cultivate our roads, to dig out our rocks, to pull out our weeds. There is no marble slab that is too wide, too thick, or too old that the power of the seed of Jesus Christ cannot split in two, giving you and me new growth and new life. Praise be to God. Amen.